else. So that might have been better. Mine is how to get men involved in the local church. And I've kind of got it set up to kind of look at the problem and maybe what we can do about it. But just looking at some of the statistics, church attendance is down. In 1993, they said about 85% of people would say that they attended church. Currently, and this is in the United States, it's about 76%. And this is a Barna poll that was just completed, I think, in December. And so looking at why some of that might be, or the numbers behind these statistics, 40% of Americans say they attend church every week. 20% of Americans actually attend church every week. In 2000, it said 31% of churches said they had excellent financial health, and in 2010, that was 14%. It's less than half. So the giving is down due to the fact that the attendance is down. Every year, Barna said 2.7 million church members fall into inactivity, and he defined that as hadn't attended at all in the last 6 months. These are a little dated, but from 1990 to 2000, in the Protestant church, the membership declined by 5 million people. And in the same time, the U.S. population increased by 24 million people. And this one shocked me a little bit, but half of the churches in the United States between 2010 and 2012 didn't add a single new member. And a lot of those declined or closed. So the question is why is that happening? A lot of people think the church is too judgmental, it's irrelevant, it's hypocritical, or it's too political. Currently, the gay marriage issue seems to be a big thing where people think the church is just way too judgmental and what they have to say doesn't matter anymore. I heard a pastor talking about it. It's just been a slow process where the church used to be the center of a community and now we're not. It was just expected that people would go. But I remember growing up, I was at the age that people, summers, you went out to play. You didn't worry about, and so we go out, I played baseball, basketball, football, whatever it was. You came inside because you had to eat dinner, and then you went back out and played more, and at night we're playing kick the can, capture the flag, anything like that. And it was always a deal where at some point, Mom would stick her head out the door and say, "Jimmy, come on in." I'd say, "Mom, no." And then a little bit later, "Jimmy Hale, get in here." No, we're not doing that. And then, you get to the third name, which James Durward Hale, you get in now. And you come in and say, "Mom, why do I have to come in?" She goes, "Because it's dark outside." He says, "No, it's not dark outside. I've been playing outside all day. It's nice." And she says, "No, turn around, look." And you look, and it's pitch black. But it's a gradual, the culture just changes gradually, and you don't realize what's going on. And there's a verse, John 3:16, talks about, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only son," I just got nervous, "that whoever believes in him wouldn't perish. For God didn't send his son into the world, but the world to condemn the world, but that the world be saved through him." But then it says, "Whoever believes in him isn't condemned, but whoever does believe in him does not believe in him stands condemned already, because they haven't believed in the name of God." So he sent us a solution to a problem that we probably didn't know we had. But then it says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love the darkness instead of the light because their deeds were evil. So everyone who does evil hates the light. And so we get in to where we don't even realize we're in darkness and we don't know what the light is. So the church needs to find a way to get back to being the light. And there's some more numbers. It's kind of hard to see here, but this is about the 50% line. So this is smaller. Churched and unchurched. So unchurched, over 50% men, 70% white, right around 50%. This is the mosaics and and the busters, but men have left the church. And as a result, women then fill the role. It reminds me of the garden, that men just don't. We are called to be leaders, but we don't step up to that leadership. When Eve ate of the fruit, and God said, "What are you doing?" She just turned around. Adam was right there. He just didn't say anything, because men tend to not step up if somebody else is going to do it. So, of those 76% that aren't going, this kind of puts a different slant on it. This is some research by Ed Stetzer. But he says it divides up pretty evenly into three different categories. There's cultural Christians who just say, yeah, I'm an American, I'm a Christian, so sure, I'll check that box. There's the congregational Christians, which are people that go to church the Easters and Sundays and some other times spattered throughout the year. And then there's convictional Christians, and that's what we're trying to get people to move into. That's what I'm hoping we are. That's what the leadership's. We're trying to get people to where not only do they say they're Christians, but they practice it. That's their worldview. And some of the reasons I think that the numbers are going down is because it's becoming more culturally acceptable to just check the box that says none. I don't do that. You don't have to say I'm Christian or I'm Catholic or I'm Muslim. I can just be nothing. And that is actually probably more culturally acceptable than saying you are a Christian. So my research proposal kind of, I don't know if it's split, but I started with how to get men involved in the local church, and the more I look at it, I also see the feminization of the American church as part of the problem. And to clarify that, Matt Chandler said God designs men and women to be equal in value but different in their role. Together they help each other and the church. When men and women fulfill their God-given roles, joy and human flourishing abound. So men and women are equally important, but we've been given different roles. And when the men aren't there, the women will step in and fill that role. And as the feminization, this is a book that was recommended to me. Evangelical Protestantism, despite its efforts to recruit men, is hampered by a tradition that not only emphasizes verbal expressions of emotion, but highly feminine emotion at that. We talk about, falling in love with Jesus. We sing hymns, Jesus, lover of my soul, things that men might not be comfortable with. And we preach about Jesus as a caretaker and a shepherd, and he is, and that's important, but we don't preach about Jesus as a warrior. We see the story of him walking in and throwing the money changers at the temple. That's not the meek, weak person that we see. So there is a balance, and we've taken off half of who Christ was when we only preach the more feminine traits of Jesus. And I'm not sure why it was in my phone, but just during one of the breaks I looked, and I had a quote from Dorothy Sayers that said, "We've declawed the Lion of Judah to make him acceptable to timid old women." So how do we get, well, and then another thing that tends to happen, and these are generalizations, but churches with female leadership tend to be more liberal theologically. Men tend to say, okay, there's a problem. Let's look at the rule book. What does it say? We'll do what the rule book says. Women tend to value relationships, so if there's a problem, they're going to do what will help the relationship at the expense of what the rules say. And again, that's a generalization, but that leads to more liberal thought in the church. So how do we get men involved in the church? There's a man named David Morrow. He's written a couple books. One of them's called Why Men Hate Going to Church, but he talked about there being three dimensions of a man's soul, and there were the three apostles, or the three inner circle, Peter, James, and John. And Peter kind of represents the will, James represents the mind, and John the emotion. And when you think of a normal church service, we do the worship, which kind of feeds into the emotion. We do the sermon, which will feed the mind. But for the Peters, there's nothing that satisfies that need of the will. So for me, it's not a big deal because I'm more of a James, appropriately named. But I'm good with the sermon. I'm good with the mind and the thinking through the stuff. But the people that need the action are left with nothing. Another pastor that I talked about the things that a man needs. He needs a job. We see that in the Garden of Eden before the fall. God placed Adam in the garden and said, tend it. He gave him a job to do, which was, I want to say Genesis 2:14. He needs adventure. We've talked about that with Becca's son. He's going on these adventures and these missions trips. A lot of, I know post-traumatic stress when soldiers come back is a way more complex issue than this, but they've been someplace where the adrenaline is on full speed, and then they come back here and there's nothing to satisfy that adventure. And then they need a challenge. They need to be told, okay, here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to step up to do. So how do we do that in a way that will call men back into the church? A separate pastor that I talked to is, for what do we do, said one of the things that he says is we bless them. When they come in, when he said that it sounded odd to me, but we acknowledge that they're there. Pastors can meet with them, invite them into their home. I know a former pastor that I had just had a game night and people came over, but then I had a connection with him. And I mean, he did things, we went out and watched a game and ate wings. I mean, just little things like that. And then we formed relationships with him. We've talked about this a lot. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis that this is more about morality, but he says, every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. That is why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. When you're being taught how to use any machine, the instructor keeps on saying, no, don't do it like that. Because of course, there are all sorts of things that look right and seem to you the natural way of treating the machine, but don't really work. So we need men to come alongside and say, this doesn't really work the way you're doing it. Proverbs says, there's a way that seems right to man, but it leads to death. The things that seem like they'll fulfill my needs, because I'm thinking as a natural man, are not the things that I need. So as we're reforming those relationships with men, we can train them, how do you be a man? So then you challenge them, message to take your wife out to dinner, to spend more time with your kids, to be a better example of Christ at work, to not have that sacred and secular separation, to see that all of life is sacred. And then you let them fail. We talked about this. I've heard lots of pieces of my talk in other presentations, but that's how we show the men the gospel message. We say, okay, you've not met the challenge, but that's okay, because God still loves you, we still accept you. That's how we demonstrate grace to men. So, and men tend to be in places where they don't feel like they can fail, that they feel like they have to be perfect. They need a place where they can come and not feel that pressure. And Paul said, I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. We figure out what men need. We do the things that men need us to do, and become who they need us to become, so that we can draw them to Christ. So who benefits from this? Men benefit. The research says that men that are involved in church have better home lives, have better marriages, have better families, have more satisfaction in their careers. The women benefit because now they're freed to fill the role that they don't have to fill the men's role anymore. They can fill the role that they were created to do. And the church benefits because they have the leadership that is supposed to be there. They have the balance between the men and the women and the perspectives that each bring. And there There's some references, but there's some different directions that can go from there. So I've talked to a couple leaders of national men's ministries, people that have written some books on why men. David Murrow wrote the Why Men Don't Go to Church. And so I've talked to the leadership of the men's ministries at those churches to ask if we can have a time to talk. I've talked to 4 or 5 different churches in my area to find out, what do you do that's effective? You know, what brings men in, and how do we get them to move to that next step? If they're just cultural Christians, how do we get them at least to be in the church? If they're congregational Christians, how do we get them to be the committed Christians that we want them to be? How do we get them to integrate what the church does and what the gospel is into their worldview and into their lives?
Very good.
That's it.